Salutations, future Twig. Past Twig here once again. We're back with another deck tech for everybody. Today's deck is entitled, I'm going to break the stock markets, then I'm going to break your knees. And you'll see exactly why when you see the commander that we've chosen for this deck. And I can summarize this deck in three simple phrases, which is politics, proliferate, and push through their defenses, because that is exactly what this deck aims to do in the various stages of the game. Moving on to the inspiration for this deck, a couple of days ago I actually posted a card callout for Tarian's Journal, and during that I happened to mention a particular commander, and that commander was Fane the Broker, as there was a lot of synergy I saw between this card and what Fane the Broker is trying to do. And what I noticed was that I thought Fane the Broker was far more popular than he actually is. Quick overview is that he's a legendary human warlock, 3/3 for 3, where he has the ability to sack a creature and put 2+1/+1 counters on another target creature. You can remove a counter from a creature you control to create treasure tokens. You can sacrifice artifacts to create 2/1 flying inkling creatures that are black and white. And last but not least is that you can pay 3 colorless and 1 black mana to untap him and repeat this process. So he's kind of like this little toolbox, little engine commander. And he's only 24 cents, and so I thought he would be incredibly popular near the top of the list, at least in like the top 500 commanders on EDHREC. I was completely wrong. Not even close. He doesn't even have 350 decks in total on EDHREC, barely above the 2,000 rank line, which is insane to me, given how much this commander's doing. If I had to guess, it's because while he is a toolbox commander and they're decently popular, he's a mono-colored toolbox commander, and those tend to be a little bit less popular because you're a bit more limited on the types of cards you can use. With all that being said, I'm happy to say that I could not resist the Siren's Call of building another deck, and as such, I've put together a deck that I think really takes advantage of this commander and makes it a really fun experience. So let's get right on into it. First off, you have politics, and this is kind of the early part of your game. So what you're going to be trying to do is kill off creatures such as Beamsaw Prospector from the newest set, Edge of Eternities, and trying to gets a lot of values from them. In particular, I like Beamsaw Prospector in this application, because of course he has the death trigger. He's a creature, so of course you can put +1/+1 counters on other creatures, and in particular put +1/+1 counters on your opponent's creatures, encouraging them to attack people who are not you, because you have a lot of disposable minions and a couple of death touch minions to throw in their face, and people don't like losing their stuff traditionally, so you're throwing +1/+1 counters around and encouraging people to attack each other and beat each other down for you, at least in this early start part of the game. Additionally, Beamsaw Prospector is wonderful in this application because he creates a lander artifact token. So it's an artifact that you can also kill to make another 2/1, so you have more flyers and blockers for yourself. Additionally, you can pay 2 mana, which I will tell you right now, this deck is very good at generating mana. And when you do, you can actually sacrifice that lander token instead and get out a basic land card onto the battlefield tapped, which is great because it allows you to ramp. And again, having lots of mana is fantastic, especially given the fact that our commander has an activated mana cost to untap himself, which allows you to perhaps not go infinite with the cards that we're using, but at the very least get off several activations a turn and get a lot of fun synergies going on. Moving on from that, of course, you don't only want to rely on the commander as a sacrifice outlet, because of course removal exists. So I have other various sacrifice outlets in the deck. One in particular that I wanted to highlight was actually Ashnod Flex Mechanist, because she's a fantastic 1-drop. She has Death Touch, which again, if we're throwing +1/+1 counters on our opponent's creatures potentially, that's going to be a great discouragement from them attacking at us, and instead swinging at other people, so we get more damage moving to our other opponents. Additionally, whenever she attacks, we can sacrifice a creature, so she's a sacrifice outlet, and if we do, we can create a tapped Power Stone token. And while these were a kind of a niche mechanic from the Brothers War set, Power Stone tokens are so powerful because while they do come in tapped, they're artifact tokens, so again, we can actually sacrifice them using Fane to generate 2/1 Inklings of Flying, but additionally, they're artifact tokens that basically say you can tap them down as a mana rock for 1 colorless mana, and the only restriction on that mana is that it cannot be used to cast non-artifact spells. However, as you may have noticed from that wording, that does not apply to creature abilities. So obviously we can use that to activate Thane's activated ability, and we also have other creatures in this deck that have activated abilities, and as such, that mana can again go towards funding those creatures, which is fantastic. Last but not least, when you're in a sacrifice theme, you also want payoffs for creatures dying, and a card that I was so happy to be able to include in this deck is Scavenger's Talent, which of course allows us to make food artifact tokens whenever we are sacrificing creatures once per turn. This is great because again, artifacts to sacrifice a Thane. Food tokens are very useful, especially in a mono black deck, because being able to, there's not a lot of life gain in mono black, so having the ability to regenerate life for yourself, especially on top of doing what your deck's already trying to do, is wonderful. Not to mention that as you upgrade those levels, you get the mill cards whenever you sacrifice permanents, which for us is actually quite essential. And potentially you can also use this as a little bit of milling if your opponents are trying to like tutor stuff to the top of their library, which can happen with like stuff like Vampiric Tutor. Lastly, that third level ability is so powerful in this deck because we can generate a lot of different types of tokens. We can of course sacrifice them since a lot of them are non-land permanents, of course. And when we do so, we get to return creature cards straight from our graveyard to the battlefield with finality counters on them. And for those of you who don't know, a creature with a finality counter on it, as long as that counter is on the creature, whenever that creature would leave the battlefield, it gets exiled immediately. However, as you may remember, Thane the Broker has second ability says that you can remove a counter from a creature that you control to create a treasure token. So what you can do on your end step, you can use Scavenger's Talent's third ability, you can sacrifice a couple of other artifacts, say 3 treasure tokens in this example. You can get out a creature with a finality counter on it, and as I will tell you right now, a lot of our creatures also have enter the battlefield effects that are quite powerful. Get that creature back out of the graveyard and onto the battlefield, and then you can immediately tap Thane, remove that finality counter so it will just die and go to the graveyard again, and in doing so, create a treasure token to get back one of those non-land permanents you sacrificed. So there's a great little bit of synergy going on here, and I think there's a lot that can be done with this. Moving on into more of the mid-game and kind of the second major theme of this deck, we have Proliferation. There aren't a whole lot of cards that directly say Proliferate in black. There's only a handful. But there are a lot of things that, artifacts that contain stuff called charge counters. And charge counters are something that we can proliferate and work with various counter synergies to get powerful effects such as the Lux Cannon. Lux Cannon is a card I've always wanted to use, and I'm excited to try it out in this deck, where you can basically put charge counters on it by tapping it. But once you have 3 charge counters on it, you can actually remove them by tapping this artifact, and when you do, you can destroy a permanent. Note that does not say non-land permanent, so yes, you can actually use this to target opponent lands. I would say you probably don't want to do that too much unless you want to draw ire from players, but if somebody drops like a Yavimaya or drops a Cabal Coffers, lands that are high value, very dangerous targets to keep alive, absolutely you can use this card to blow them up. Continuing onwards, you also have very inexpensive versions of Proliferate, like Black Belly Rat. I think this card's only like 10 cents, and what's wonderful about him is he's a wonderful little meat body that you can use to kill him off, and he can proliferate, and there's a ton of different cards in this deck that utilize different kinds of counters, so that proliferation trigger, very helpful, and also means you don't have to worry about blocking of him because you don't mind him dying. Additionally, that Toxic one I'm not intending to have that come into play too much, but I will say, if you drop him down early and get a single poison counter onto another player, well, there are a number of ways to proliferate and spread counters around in this deck, and getting out poison counters does give you an alternate way of killing off players, especially in the event that some of these players have a lot of powerful cards and it becomes difficult for our other strategies of attacking to get through them in the later game. Last but not least, when discussing Proliferate are, of course, creatures that benefit from Proliferate. In particular, a creature I think of is Body Launderer, which is a conniving creature, so we get him put +1/+1 counters on himself. He has Death Touch, which again we've talked about the utility of Death Touch in this deck, and the best part is that when he dies, you can return another target non-road creature card with equal or lesser power, such as +1/+1 counters, from your graveyard to the battlefield. So what's wonderful about this guy is during the time where you're proliferating, he can grow in power, he dies, and then he gets something else out that's equally scary back onto the battlefield as he enters the graveyard, and then you just kind of keep cycling the two and repeating the process. And all of this wonderful value takes us into the third and final section of this deck, which is the pushing through their defenses and closing out the game. And right off the bat, I want to talk about a card that is very inexpensive. I think, again, this is like a 20-cent card maybe, and I think is actually quite powerful, which is Swai Requisitioner, which is a 5-mana creature by default. However, it has Improvise, where you can actually tap your artifacts to help cast a spell, and again, we have a commander that actively makes treasure tokens, and I will tell you right now, we also have a ton of different artifacts in this deck, so having the ability to just tap a bunch of artifacts down and make her cost more inexpensive is wonderful. And that second ability is also nice, which is that whenever a non-token artifact you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you get to create a 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature token. And we have a fair number of non-token artifacts in this deck. A number of them want to die and kill themselves, and obviously when you do that, you get out free bodies to put towards your army. And the best part is you can use Fan the Broker if you want to turn those 1/1 colorless servo artifacts into 2/1 flyers that are Inklings, and that we can get in for more damage. Moving on, we also have options in case we can only attack with one creature, or if there's a lot of defenses and we have to kind of be a bit more sneaky. So obviously we have flyers which can usually go over the top, but in the event that we need to do like one powerful strike, we have cards like the new Secluded Starforge, which basically that second ability allows us to pay 2, tap Starforge, tap as many artifacts as we want, such as treasures, and we can give target creature +X/+0 until end of turn. It is a sorcery speed, but there are ways that we can get a single creature on through their defenses and potentially just wipe them out with a massive attack right off the bat. Additionally, there are cards, of course, like we've talked about with Body Launderer, that the more power they have, the better their abilities are, and naturally we can also use this in that niche example. If for some reason we have a ton of mana left over before our upkeep step, we can actually spend all that mana with Secluded Starforge and create a 2/2 colorless robot artifact creature token in the event that we need another body for whatever reason. Additionally, we also have a backup solution in case for whatever reason the game is stalled or creatures cannot attack for whatever effects might be on the field. And mentioning creatures that benefit from having their power buffed, we're talking about Marionette Master. This card's a little bit over $1, so I kind of just threw her in there because I wanted to have her. But I will say, this creature spreads about +1/+1 counters on herself, so we can proliferate them. She can create a bunch of little tiny bodies, so we can sacrifice them. And most importantly, whenever an artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, note that it can include treasure tokens, which our commander generates. As you do so, target opponent loses life equal to Marionette Master's power. This one card by itself, especially if our proliferate and artifact-heavy deck synergies, means that we can actually drain our opponents out of life in the event that the game is stalled and we can't attack. And with the main synergies of this deck out of the way, let's get into some of the more exciting and fun cards that I'm looking forward to testing out in this deck. First up, we have Marketback Walker, which came out in the Aether Drift set very recently, and this is kind of a spoof on the Hangerback Walker, which we also have in the deck, which these are like XX creatures, so they'll probably be coming down for 2 mana. They come in with +1/+1 counters, and that they have various benefits depending on how many +1/+1 counters they have on them when they die. So with Marketback Walker, for each +1/+1 counter it has on it, when it dies, you draw a card for that +1/+1 counter. Obviously, as you notice, our commander's first ability is that you can sacrifice a creature. You can put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. So in the event that we have a board state where our opponents do not have creatures we want to add a buff up, maybe they have too many creatures of trample, or there aren't any creatures on their side of the field, in that case, we can actually put our +1/+1 counters on Marketback Walker and just make it so that when that creature eventually dies, say we actually killed off with our commander, we draw a lot of cards. Because if you think about it, sacrificing a creature to put 2 +1/+1 counters on Marketback Walker, that's 2 more cards you're going to get back when that creature dies, which is fantastic. Keeping in the +1/+1 counter theme, we actually have Cryptic Trialbite. This is a very similar thing, and it kind of works in the same way as Marketback Walker, except for that its +1/+1 counters can be removed, and you can actually use them to generate 2 mana each, which is fantastic. The only restriction is you can only spend this mana to activate abilities. Again, you've already seen a number of cards, such as Marketback Walker or Secluded Starforge, that care about having tons of colorless mana, so that's not an issue. Additionally, this can actually be used to untap our commander, and while we don't have a way to go infinite with it, it can definitely help our commander to untap several times for putting +1/+1 counters on it, and kind of helping to create a nice little value engine between these two cards. I've always wanted to use this card. I feel that at 30 cents it is heavily undervalued, and I think this is a perfect deck to try out this card and make sure it works. Last but not least is another card from the Brothers War that is like 20 cents, and I think was undervalued a little bit. Slagstone Refinery is interesting because it basically says that whenever it or another non-token artifact you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield or into exile, so it doesn't matter as long as the artifact leaves, you can create a tapped Power Stone token. Obviously, this type of mana ramp is not ideal if you're trying to cast a lot of spells, but as we're trying to activate a lot of abilities, especially if our commander, this is actually quite powerful, and we do run a fair number of non-token artifacts, both creatures and otherwise, that are going to be entering the graveyard fairly commonly, and as they do so, we're getting free Power Stone tokens out of them that are tapped so that we can use for our commander, and even again, if we don't use a Power Stone token for anything other than a sack source for our commander to build 2/1 Flying Inklings, that is still a fantastic value. Moving on, we also have another Aether Drift card that I didn't even realize until I started making this deck and I stumbled upon it by accident, which is Demonic Junker, which has affinity for artifacts, which just means that for each artifact on the field that we control, it costs 1 less to cast. So as you can imagine, we have a bunch of different artifacts we're going to be casting anyways. Not to mention our commander can make treasure tokens, which are just fantastic for lowering the cost of this card. When it enters, for each player, we can destroy up to 1 target creature that player controls. If a creature you control is destroyed this way, put 2 +1/+1 counters on this vehicle. So this does a lot of fantastic things for us. It is removal, so we can blow up our opponent's creatures. It is a sacrifice outlet for us because we can blow up our own creatures. And with the +1/+1 counters that enter up on this vehicle, we can actually eat those +1/+1 counters with Fan the Broker that make treasure tokens. And as long as we choose to crew this card, it can act as both an artifact or a creature when we sacrifice it and then recur it. So there's a lot of fantastic ways we can use this. Kind of sticking to the counter theme, but looking at the -1/-1 counters now, we're looking at Puppeteer Click, which is a very powerful card that I think is going to be very powerful in this deck, especially with our commander's abilities to eat counters off of our creatures, it is a 5 mana 3/2 fairy wizard creature with flying and the ability that when it enters the battlefield, Put target creature from an opponent's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. That creature gains haste. At the beginning of your next instep, exile it. And what's awesome is that this card has persist, which means when you kill it, if it didn't have a -1/-1 counter on it, which none of the cards in our deck actually give -1/-1 counters, it comes back to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on it. Obviously, with Feign the Broker out, you can just eat that -1/-1 counter, and you can just keep killing this creature. You can keep bringing it back, and you can keep stealing creatures from your opponent's graveyard. And I can tell you right now, as a budget deck brewer, it is amazing how many great creatures your opponents will allow to enter their graveyards for whatever reason. And getting back some of their powerful $20, $30 creatures for free virtually is a wonderful feeling and a great way to end the game in your favor. Last but not least is actually one of the first cards I think I ever owned in Magic the Gathering. I feel like I've had this card forever in my collection, but just never had a deck for it. And I'm very happy to say that I think Core Prowl makes a perfect amount of sense in this deck. It's an artifact and a creature, so it has great synergy with Feign. It allows you to be prolific whenever it enters the graveyard from the battlefield. And perhaps, very interestingly, it has Infect. And I know everyone panics when they see Infect. However, it is the only card with Infect in this deck, which I think is okay. While it is not Death Touch, this does discourage our opponents from attacking us, because adding those -1 counters onto their creatures is never fun. And if we're able to slip this card on through and attack somebody directly with it, that gives poison counters to them. And again, poison counters are another way we can close out the game with our different various sources of proliferation, and that might be crucial in the event that we have people that prove tough to get through with creature attacks. And last but not least, we actually have a cool set of cards that I've always wanted to use and that I found work very well in this deck and have a very nice cool interaction with each other. So let's get right into it. First off is Core Tapper. And believe it or not, this was actually the card that I wanted to help kind of build around a little bit, and the reason I kind of went with an artifact kind of sacrifice synergy for this commander and this entire deck. Core Tapper is a 2-mana artifact mirror creature, so again, he can work with Feign in both ways if you want to have either an artifact to sacrifice or a creature to sacrifice. If you allow him to tap, he can put a charge counter on target artifact, and if you sacrifice him, which you can do for free at instant speed, you can put 2 charge counters on target artifact. Now, admittedly, there are only about 6 or 7 cards in this deck that actually feature charge counters. With that being said, it is still a very powerful 2-mana card because there are a bunch of synergies with both our commander and other cards that care about non-token artifacts dying. And again, 2 mana, you can sacrifice them instant speed, and you can put those counters on another target artifact. And even if it does not use charge counters, you can still eat those charge counters with Feign to get treasure tokens, so there's still some value there. Additionally, of course, the 6 or 7 cards that do feature charge counters in this deck are incredibly powerful cards, especially looking at mana generators like Empowered Auto Generator here. That is a 4-mana artifact that enters the battlefield tapped, and whenever you tap it, you put a charge counter on it, and then you can add X mana of any one color, say black, and where X is the number of charge counters on this artifact. As you can no doubt imagine, having Core Tapper out and being able to tap him down and putting 3 charge counters immediately on a brand new, fresh, Empowered Auto Generator is very scary, because then when it taps, you put a charge counter on it, and it taps for 4 mana. As you can imagine, that is very quickly going to get out of hand, and that allows you to use your commander's ability a lot because you can just continuously untap him. Additionally, I also found another kind of niche janky card, which I've not made a card call out about, but I'm looking forward to in the future, which is Draw Scorpion, which is an artifact creature that says whenever he or another artifact creature is put into a graveyard from play, you may untap target artifact. And believe it or not, we're running the Transmogrifying, I forget the name of it. It's like the 2-mana rock that also has a secondary ability that you can tap it down to have target non-land permanent become an artifact until end of turn. If that card is out, or even if it's not, there are a ton of different artifacts in this deck, and a fair number of them are mana rocks, and obviously being able to untap them, even if you can only untap them once, is fantastic because then you get double the mana, and there are so many powerful mana surges you can have in this deck using Draw Scorpion. Additionally, there are just other cards where it's nice to be able to just untap an artifact, be it a creature for blocking, or if you make your commander an artifact, you can actually untap him for basically free. And there's just a lot of little synergies with this deck that I think Draw Scorpion makes a fantastic include for. Last but not least, let's talk about the mana curve of this deck. As you can see, it is very heavily weighted towards the smaller side, with those 0 costs actually being probably close to 2 costs because of the XX creatures. So we have a lot of 2-cost creatures, which makes sense. Our commander comes down at 3, and he has a lot of activated abilities which cost 4 mana. So you want to have the heavier side of your deck be a lot slimmer because you have a lot of powerful activated abilities that you want to constantly have mana for. Very geared towards the beginning of the mana curve of this deck. And as you can see, it's about $39 roughly on Moxfield. I will say that, as you can see, this has a 34 card sideboard because I'm still messing around with some cards and figuring out some synergies. Some of those cards on that sideboard are $1 a piece almost. As such, you're probably looking at this deck being closer to about $33, $35 if we're being honest with ourselves. Much cheaper than it looks on paper. And that is actually all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for tuning into this Deck Tech, and have a wonderful day all. Take care.